and welcome to Maths on the Move, the podcast from plus.maths.org. I'm Rachel Thomas. You're listening to some of the wonderful music by Dominic Brennan that's from the musical The Universal Machine. We were lucky enough to see this show in London back in 2013, and in this episode, which is part of our series of podcasts about bringing maths to the stage and screen, we revisit our interview with some of the people who made the show happen. The musical is about the life and work of Alan Turing, who many know as a code breaker in the Second World War, but also was a brilliant mathematician. Turing was fascinated by the idea that we might be able to build machines that could think. And as well as helping with his code breaking, it also led him to really build some of the foundations of computer science and modern mathematical logic. For example, he did work on something called the Entscheidungs problem, which you hear mentioned later in the episode. And this problem involves determining whether logical statements can be proved using algorithms, and kind of gets to the limits of what could be achieved using mechanized thought. But there's so much more to his mathematical work. For example, he came up with a beautiful theory of morphogenesis, which is also mentioned in the episode, which offers a possible explanation of how patterns such as leopard spots might form in nature. The single mathematical paper he wrote on morphogenesis over 70 years ago is still cited by researchers today. I guess what surprised us about the choice of Alan Turing specifically for a musical was that his was such a tragic life. He worked as a code breaker, but his work was classified. So there was no recognition of this important contribution he made to the war effort until well after his death. And very tragically, he was convicted in the early 50s of indecency because homosexuality was still illegal, and he was treated terribly. You'll hear when we saw the play and recorded the interview in early 2013, he still hadn't received a pardon after his death. And in fact, at the end of 2013, in December 2013, he finally did receive an official pardon, but only after much campaigning. And he died in mysterious circumstances, officially declared that he died by suicide through an apple laced with cyanide. But as you'll hear, this has been debated. But we're really happy to say that we really enjoyed the show. It was a brilliant depiction of mathematics and a mathematician brought to life. And after the show, my colleague Marion Freiberger interviewed the writer and director David Byrne, Richard Delaney, who plays Turing brilliantly, and assistant director Natalie York. And Marianne started off by asking director David Byrne what on earth made him decide to make a musical rather than just a play of Turing's life.
I think the reason it's musicalised, we always start with trying to work out what the core of that story is and how we're going to put it together. And the basics of the story very early on were that Alan was a man who had incredible intelligence and could see patterns and things thinking around him, but was failing to make connections with those in his life. And the people around him were far more at ease and erudite and sort of were gliding seamlessly through situations that he found incredibly difficult, the things that we find most natural to ourselves. And it seemed very logical to find a language in which people could physically move in a very sort of easy and sort of free way and were able to emotionally express themselves. And song and dance seemed perfectly right for that. Not traditional song and dance like you get in sort of like a chorus line, but to use music and movement in a choreographed way that would act like salt on the story to really bring that out in a more theatrical sense, and that seemed right. We really fought against it for ages, but we couldn't find anything that quite fitted it as nicely. So that's sort of what's a musical. That, and he did so much. And the more, especially, I mean, Dickie's done a huge amount of research on Alan, and the more that we find out about him, the more the story expands and expands and expands. And to condense it down, you need to find a form that means that you can get across the emotional truth of a situation and move on. In a traditional play or a film, that takes a long time. You know, if you meet someone in a film and two people fall in love, you know, they meet and then you have a whole series of sort of various misunderstandings and that goes on. In something that you use music and song for, you can sing a song and in 3 minutes you have established that relationship and you've got it and you can move on with your story.
That's great, because we were discussing it afterwards, thinking like, why was it musical? And that's one of the things we came up with, that we thought, because the story is so dense and emotionally complicated as well as scientifically complicated, it's a different way to get things across that is just much more compact, I suppose. Yes. So, that's what we thought. That's interesting. So, were you familiar with Alan Turing and his biography before you kind of started approaching this role?
Not really, no. I mean, I knew a little bit about him vaguely. I sort of had some sort of clue that he was someone who was involved with breaking the Enigma code, and that was about it, really. And then when I was sort of first approached about the project, I started to do a little bit of background reading, and I reached for I think it was the Hodges I went for first. Probably after Wikipedia, shame on me. Sort of a quick bit of Googling to see what I'd let myself in for. And then sort of worked my way through that. And it really whet my appetite as well, more than anything else, because I just hadn't anticipated the sheer scope and the epic nature of this. I mean, because it really is quite a short life. I mean, and to achieve so much in such a short time, it is phenomenal. And it really did whet my appetite, and just sort of went on to read as much as I could. Which is always a danger as well, I suppose, when you're approaching a project, because the idea is often to do your research and then forget about it and just concentrate with the task at hand, which has been harder to do with this project, strangely. You desperately want to sort of keep hold of a lot of the information you've got, I think, because it is so timely. Especially with its centenary year, and knowing some of its family and people who are connected with the story who are coming to see it. It feels like it has a real importance to be told, and it is an important story that I think people aren't aware enough.
No, and how do you feel about the lack of pardon that he still has not been officially pardoned?
I imagine there are 100 political reasons for that happening. I mean, I think the pardon's obviously a very symbolic thing of sort of recognition. I think what's more important than the pardon is the fact that his work and his life is becoming more and more talked about and more discussed. I mean, Alan Turing, I would say, is more famous now than at any point since his death, and he's becoming more and more famous. And actually, that's, I think, what's been a bit strange for the families that come, because we've had families from all the show, from all the characters in the show. Max Newman's family are in tonight, his granddaughter, and these people, especially Christopher Morcom's family came, who was Alan's school friend until the age of 19, where he passed away. Obviously, the early parts of their life, they wouldn't have even really known who this person was, apart from a nephew of theirs that passed away very young. And suddenly, they're going to see plays about him, and his work and his writings and his letters are becoming discussed and opened up. And for Alan's family, I think that's more and more. I mean, there's very few people you can ask about Alan Turing now, and they wouldn't know. And I think what Dickie said was really interesting, that he knew a little bit about him. I think we've found that with the audiences that have come, a lot of people have their own Alan Turing. We've had a lot of people from the gay community come, for which Alan Turing has become a real figurehead of that sort of movement, of someone who is absolutely brilliant and sort of faced persecution in the incredibly recent past. We've had people from Bletchley Park come, for whom he is a figurehead for all of the unrecognised work those people did in the Second World War. We've had people from the computer movement come, for whom he is one of the sort of godfathers of the original thinking with computable numbers, and obviously the Turing-Welshman bomb. We've had people from his family come, who are starting to sort of rediscover things about their sort of long nephew. Even now, they're getting letters and things about things they didn't know about. And everyone has their own slice of him. And that's been really fascinating. To try and put something together that satisfies all of those people has been a real challenge. And I'm glad we didn't think about it too much before everything. Because I think it would have... We've been really...
How did the family react?
Incredibly well. We were really flattered. I mean, they spoke to you particularly. I mean, I think it's very strange for them, because... Dickie looks quite a lot like Alan.
Yeah.
There was an audible gasp the night the nieces were in, and when Dickie sort of stepped out sort of through the sort of haze. And there are moments and mannerisms, obviously Dickie's been looking into it, which are incredibly close. Judith, who plays Sarah Turing, Alan's mother, apparently has got her down to a T. It was harder with her because there's less about her. There's lots by her, but very little about her. And I think they found that very peculiar. I think they've liked the way we've told the story. I think a lot of the stories previously have sensationalised it and have focused on the suicide or focused on the arrest, and I think there's a lot of questions surrounding that, and I think they feel it's been trivialised a little bit. So I think what they've liked about this is that there's been something that has really addressed it in a sort of really robust, sort of rounded way, and that hasn't made any big presumptions.
Yeah. I found the way in which those things, the suicide came across, for example, I really liked that as well, because it was dropped in early, and it was dropped in a kind of quite unspectacular way. So it was taking away this potential over-dramatization of it. Yeah, I like that.
And again, the more we find out about the suicide, the less likely it seems to be that it was suicide.
It is disputed that it was a suicide.
Yes, the coroner who declared that it was suicide. There was the smell of almonds, wasn't it, in the body? But apparently he was very gun-ho at sort of diagnosing this. The apple he was supposed to have eaten and taken the suicide off was never examined or checked for suicide, for cyanide on it. He had bought, we found all sorts of weird facts out. No note was left behind by Alan. He was an incredibly ordered man. He'd bought new clothes that morning. There was no sign really beforehand. There's lots of things, and they did find some things in his house which could have meant it was an accidental death. He had a room in his house called the Nightmare Room, where he used to keep all of his chemicals, and he was an incredibly messy man. And it could be likely that he got it on hands or his clothes or something else, and it just transferred across.
Right. So the alternative explanation is accidental death. Okay.
There are conspiracy theorists that also say that it could be the British government. He was he met a man in Norway just before his death, which he tried to bring across back to England, and I think it was it GCHQ at the time? I can't remember which government department it was, but they barred the man from coming across, and they potentially put him under watch as well. So he's being watched around that period of time. It's all very muddied, and I think it's too easy almost. We decided it was far too easy to go down that route of having, and you can't stage ambiguity. I'm sure Dickie would have had a good go at it, but you can't have. He either actively put it on the apple and chose to eat it and kill himself, or he accidentally did it. And one of the challenges we had was like, well, how do we even begin to deal with that? And by restructuring it slightly and sort of setting up so it happens and building it around, we found a way of being able to make it unsure for the audience. And some people have said, oh, I like the way you left it open. Other people have said, oh, I like the way you dealt with the suicide. And they said, I like the fact that you say he didn't kill himself. So I think, again, people are able to, and I think Dickie's performance is wonderful at this, people are able to project their own Alan Turing onto him and onto the situation, which I think has led to a lot of people who are experts about it really liking it.
And given that those people who do know about Alan Turing, they will know the basic facts: code breaker, he was gay, then the suicide. What kind of things did you find out that were surprising, apart, like taking this kind of skeletal story for granted?
That was surprising. Oh, good grief. Well, for me, most of it was surprising because obviously my knowledge was quite sort of patchy to start with. I think what I found quite interesting on the journey of trying to sort of find out about Alan was the fact that, in contrast to Sarah, his mother, where there's a lot of stuff that she has written, and Alan has a lot of stuff written about him, there's not a lot of emotional content, and especially as an actor, the stuff that you're trying to sort of look for, ideally if you're playing a real person. You reach for any sound bites, you reach for any video footage, and of course there's nothing of that. I think the BBC did have stuff, I found, that most of it was destroyed about the 70s.
So no video footage?
No, so there was...
So how did you get... Because you mentioned just now that the family were just impressed by the similarity but also mannerism. So how did you get that?
It takes probably a tiny pinch of imagination as well to go with it. But, you're sort of looking at any photos that are there, any sort of reoccurring postural sort of quirks or anything like that. There are brief mentions of him sort of biting his nails and sort of also the reference to rickets when he was younger, so that sort of informed the way he walked. I mean, you don't want to create too much of a caricature or anything like that, but there's elements you can tap into. But I don't think it's any strange coincidence that so many of the books that are written after him as well are also called the Enigma. This is a man who had escaped public light for so long. I mean, he wasn't really famous until the 70s, really, till all the information came available to us.
Yeah.
There's such contradictory information about him,
yeah.
isn't there? So contradictory.
You only even need to look at the sort of 3 major biographies to even see the radical differences between sort of views and the angles that they've taken on it.
What about
it was even more extreme. I mean, the Turing family have been back a few times now, and they were talking to one of the nieces and her grandson, and she said, "Oh, you haven't got the laugh right," and because apparently he has a high-pitched laugh. And I said, "Oh, we gave a good go at it." And she said, "No, it's so bad people used to leave the room because they couldn't listen to it. It was so high, it was sort of deafening." I think, God, I'm quite glad we didn't know that. I mean, the temptation to try and push you to that level.
Yeah, and I was particularly thinking about childhood things, how closely they were related to biographical stuff, especially this thing about him mentioning really early on that he wanted to be a machine.
Yes.
Where did he say that? Is there a record of him? Okay.
He had a childhood book called Natural Wonders That Every Child Should Know, which was a big influence on him, and he wrote about it later in his life, and he sort of had it his whole life. It was a very heretical book. It was an American book that was published around 1912, and it was one of the first books about nature and science which talked about it in a very non-sort of ecclesiastical, sort of religious way. So it talked about the body being a machine. It talked about, how nature grew. I mean, we've had it in rehearsals because we've found the actual book for the show. I mean, Dickie has to read it quite a lot. I've been fascinated by the chapters. I think our favourite was the ants.
Ants' noses. Yeah, ants' noses.
Yeah, and it was the early, because he was a very scientific boy. He was always sort of trying to make iodine, was, looking at nature, was sort of getting really messy sort of out in the mud wherever they were. And this book was a huge influence. And one thing we really wanted to do with this piece, and I think all sort of mathematicians and scientists sort of have this throughout their career, is the narrative of his research. So it very much started with that book. You can trace everything back to the early genesis of his work there. And then the work that he did, because he then went off to Sherborne, and him and his friend Christopher were disproving theories from Einstein and Newton that had only been professionally disproved a few years earlier. They would have no access to that sort of information. And they started to work on the idea of this, machine that could think and could work, and that fed into his university work, computable numbers. He was already thinking about that. Max Newman at university, who asked a lot of questions along Turing's line of interest. And while a lot of other people were apparently very sceptical at university about the sort of research he was doing, and he was passed over for job after job after job, he kept working on this. And then after the war, because obviously he built the machines that could think and were working like a brain. They were calculating and discarding information and working towards a solution, rather than something that did a simple function which did something. This was working things out. He then went on to the morphogenesis stuff, which was, he said, well, machines are like people and like nature, and then he started to find mechanical traits in nature all around him. And, I mean, things like the Fibonacci sequence have been written about beforehand, but he brought all of these sort of hypotheses together to sort of say, look, there is a master plan here, there is graph paper under nature, all of this is obeying sort of certain rules. And I think he went from finding the human in a machine to the machine behind everything. Mm.
And how much did any of you get into his mathematical work?
Brief, to be honest. I mean, I sort of in terms of sort of where they fell within his lifetime and what the cause and effect of his work was, I looked into. But the actual principles of his work, it was brief, just because that doesn't really fathom him.
We had moments in rehearsals where we did try and stop and sort of go, okay, this is what this is about, and this is sort of what happened.
Being like a semi-nervous breakdown on the side of the room.
And quite a lot of his early work, there was no practical use for this, because he was using it to solve very sort of almost esoteric mathematical problems, rather than working out how can we microwave food with this, or something that's very useful. Yeah. I mean, Dom looked into it an awful lot. I mean, the music contains an awful lot of patterning and mathematics that really fits his work. And the people from Bletchley Park have come. I think it's Professor Barry Green wrote us a letter saying, I saw it all. And,
really?
Yes, and they've really got it.
Okay.
He did an interview with 5 Live, which went out, I think, a few days ago, which I listened to this afternoon. He said, if you come and want to know about Turing and you like Turing, you'll enjoy it. He said, but if you know a huge amount, like we did at Bletchley Park, you'll absolutely love this. Because I think for them it's sort of like bathing in the chocolate of all of their research. I mean, for them it's a sort of sweet shop of references and notes, and they, more than anyone else, understood Dom's music and what Dom had tried to achieve and communicate with them.
And can you give an example? I mean, it's obviously difficult without listening, but is there a way in which
Fibonacci features in it an awful lot later on. The repetition of notes that gain and sort of go round and round in circles. Things like the bomb. We'd have a sequence at the end of the first half where they build the bomb, and
I love that.
where the sort of movements. I mean, the bomb is a very weird machine to look at because all the cogs are moving in slightly different patterns and at slightly different speeds. And he tried to, with the different rounds of them singing, they are there to imitate the sort of different turnings of the inner workings of the machine that was sort of happening. We go from very sort of slabby sort of ensemble numbers where they're singing about their sport and it's very bang 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 to the Police, which is bang 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 again. And as soon as you go inside his head, with those sort of numbers, it's this intricate sort of patterning and this sort of looping of ideas and thoughts against again and again and again. And that he was really keen on making sure that was sort of there. And he can go into huge amounts of detail as to how that works, and he used synthesizers that would have been around at the time to communicate the mechanics of that, as well as various bits of soundscaping to try and get that across with the sort of work.
Yeah.
Even things like and most people wouldn't notice it, but underneath the sequence where they're talking about the Enigma machine, there are moments of the sort of turning of rotors and the rounds that go round. So the first one going round and the one moving, progressing as it clicks into a certain space. He really does overthink these things to a level that only one man seems to have understood. But it does add a texture to it that really.
Did you want to say something?
Well, I suppose what was great actually about when we were talking about sort of talking about the mathematics in rehearsals, all those sorts of things. What was great in rehearsals was actually that would really genuinely stop the rehearsal because none of us would really understand it. We would all have so many questions, and it was amazing actually to see the rehearsal literally come to a standstill as everyone would suddenly actually have so many questions about especially sort of the mathematical side of things like the Entscheidungs problem. Because I think most of us really were sitting there very much not understanding, and that was a great, weirdly a great place to be from it, because you got a sense of quite how big these problems were, how complicated, how broad, and just sort of
petrifying for some of us because we didn't know how correct we were, because there's so much there. I remember one day someone asked, because obviously the play skips through quite a lot of material, because obviously Alan's work at Bletchley Park was great, but it was only one part of the work at Bletchley Park, and someone asked, so what happened after this? And to have to sit down and try to explain the different types of Enigma and the different types of machine that were built and how they all worked, and hoping I'm getting this right, because someone will ask them on an interview for Plus magazine, and we will get it wrong. So we hope it's there as much as it can be.
We were Googling as we went, trying to check all of the facts.
But I think what came across quite well as well is this massive span, because his logical work is basically meta-mathematics. Yeah. Whereas the Bletchley Park stuff is completely applied number crunching. So I thought that scope came across quite well, because it would have been maybe tempting to just reduce it to the code breaking work and say, oh, that's just building a machine that goes through.
Yeah, because people imagine him as this code breaker sitting there finding this sort of secret code, whereas actually what he did was find ways of mechanicalizing thought and solutions, really.
What is actually fascinating is when you discover the life, and you do discover that breadth of work that he did cover. I think that's when it becomes really exciting.
Very few people know about the morphogenesis side.
That's a great little
and it's
idea.
Perfect, and it's very briefly touched on in the show. We do it alongside the sort of chemical castration, because it's all about the equilibrium of nature and how, when you interfere with that, that's when things start to go awry, which is obviously perfectly timed for his own sort of hormone injections, and that sending him on a path that potentially led to him taking his own life, or at least be in a place where people could realistically think that might have happened. So it's incredibly dramatically convenient. But
Yes.
we try to touch on everything to give a breadth, because I don't think anything else has really tackled all of the work, or at least given the audience the idea of the breadth of work that he might have spanned over his life.
How much did you agonize about how much kind of mathematical content to bring across? I mean, I suppose the Enigma machine, that was brought across very well, but that's probably not too hard, because it's about combinations and there's loads of them.
Well,
But how much do you think about, like, how much to include from the Entscheidungsproblem or from other areas?
Condensing it was really difficult, and some of the stuff you either go into in full detail or you just say, I've had this idea, and you look at a piece of paper and go, that's a good idea, let's do that. The Enigma machine, I mean, we try to find the most basic root of everything. So we describe how the Enigma machine worked, but we describe how the commercial Enigma machine worked, which is a very basic model. I think there were 4 or 5 versions of the Enigma machine that were built, and they get more and more and more complicated, to the point where it would take 10 or 15 minutes to sort of explain it through properly. You start to put reflectors in and plug boards, and you start to get a variant current going through. It becomes almost impossible to really go into that. And the same with a lot of the work, how far do you go into that? And I mean, morphogenesis, we looked at it, we had all the papers there and went through it in quite a lot of detail, and to go, well, what do we need to know? And the fact that it's about nature and equilibrium, it doesn't make any real new ideas. It's the idea of bringing a lot of the thought together, and it's about how stable things can become unstable if that pattern of nature is lost. So it's about trying to find bits of his writing, because it's all his own words, to bring those together and make that work. And the same with everything else, like the Entscheidungsproblem problem, we sort of shy away from it a little bit, but it does go into the fact that this is an unsolved problem, and thanks to a general mechanical process, you can I think the audience who wants to tune into it and go, I sort of understand what's going on here. He's sort of worked this out, and he's used a machine to do it for the first time. He's looking at nature now and patterns in nature. And I think the audience who don't know about it can follow that through enough, and I think we've found just the right balance for now as to how that works.
And do you know what audience you get? Do you know who comes to see it? Is it people who would already be familiar with the story, or is it people?
Audiences for this. We have people who want to come and see a musical,
Yeah.
who've been very confused.
Yeah.
We had one girl come in who was like, "I've just been to see a chorus line. I'm going to see this, and then tomorrow I'm going to see Burn the Floor." No refunds. Although that's unfair, because she did really enjoy it. We've had a lot of people coming who want to see a musical, and some of them have really been excited by what they've seen, because it's very different to anything else that's on at the moment, or that I've seen in musical theatre. And we've had some people who have been like, there aren't enough top hats. There aren't any top hats.
Yes, that's
There have been people who come, because we've got quite a big regular audience here at the theatre, who come to see really interesting stories done in a really interesting way, and I think those people have really enjoyed it, and they've had a good time. We've had some fantastic feedback from them, from other directors and things who've come to see work here. And then we've had people who have a real mathematical, scientific Turing interest, who have been foaming at the mouth with excitement. They've really enjoyed it, and it's been so satisfying, because all the people who'd want to really love it, those people are who this show is really made for.
Yeah, and this is maybe why I kept asking you about the biographical stuff in the childhood, because when it first started, I have to admit, I went like, oh no, it's just going to be another cliched portrayal of a mathematician who's a nutcase.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh no. But then it didn't take long until I completely changed my mind. But, that relates to what you're saying, that it's a nice thing that you're able to please the mathematicians or the scientifically minded parts of your audience.
Because it would be so easy to make him look a bit crazy, because as Dickie said, there are so many ticks and sort of things that
but
start.
But they're part of the story, so they have to be there. But you managed to.
But you need to find a way through, because that didn't define who he was. And if we put sort of some sort of cartoon caricature, which I've seen before in other productions where people have really overdone it.
Yes.
I think Dickie is a particularly fine performance. He's really found his way through it, and he is the sort of emotional centre point.
That was David Byrne explaining that Richard Delaney's portrayal of Alan Turing was the emotional centre point of this show. And we certainly agree. It was an emotional show, and at times it even had us in tears. Now, you can find out more in the article that accompanies this podcast, in our review from 2013 of the musical itself, and you can find out much more about Turing's work on plus.maths.org. Just search for Turing. Or you can see the links in the episode notes. That's it for this podcast, and we'll leave you with more of Dominic Brennan's beautiful music from the show. Thanks for listening, and bye-bye.